We are finishing Caspian this week, so we're going to read chapter 11 today. The Lion Roars. When the whole party was finally awake, Lucy had to tell her story for the fourth time. The blank silence which followed was discouraging as anything could be. I don't see anything, said Peter after he had stared, his eyes sore. Can you, Susan? No, of course I can't, snapped Susan, because there isn't anything to see. She's been dreaming. Do lie down and go to sleep. And I do hope, said Lucy in a tremulous voice, that you'll come with me because I'll have to go with him whether anyone else does or not. That's nonsense talk, Lucy. Of course you can't go off on your own. Don't let her, Peter. She's being downright naughty. I'll go with her if she must go, said Edmund. She's been right before. I know she has, said Peter, and she may have been right this morning. We certainly had no luck going down the gorge still at this hour of the night, and why would Aslan be invisible to us? He never used to be. It's not like him. What does the DLF say? Oh, I say nothing at all, said the dwarf. If you all go, of course I'll go with you. If your party splits up, I'll go with the High King. It's my duty to him and to King Caspian. But if you ask my private opinion, I'm a plain dwarf who doesn't think there's much chance of finding a road by night when you can't find one by day. And I have no use for magic lions, which are talking lions and don't talk, and friendly lions, so they don't do us any good, and whopping big lions, so nobody can see them. It's all bilge and beanstalks as far as I can see. He's baiting his paw on the ground for us to hurry, said Lucy. We must go now. At least I must. You've no right to try and force the rest of us like that. It's 4-1 and you're the youngest, said Susan. Oh, come on, growled Edmund. We've got to go. There'll be no peace until we do. He fully intended to back Lucy up, but he was annoyed at losing his night's sleep and was making up for it by doing everything as sulkily as possible. On the march, then, said Peter, wearily fitting his arm into a shield strap and putting his helmet on. At any other time, he would have said something nice to Lucy, who was his favorite sister, for he knew how wretched she must be feeling. And he knew that whatever happened, it was not her fault, but he couldn't help being a little annoyed with her all the same. Susan was the worst. Supposing I started behaving like Lucy, I might threaten not to stay here, whether the rest of you went on or not. I think I shall. Obey the High King, your majesty, said Trumpkin, and let's be off. If I'm not allowed to sleep, I'd soon march and stand here talking. So at last they got on the move. Lucy went first, biting her lip, trying not to say all the things she thought she should say to Susan, for she forgot them when she fixed her eyes on Aslan. He turned and walked at a slow pace about 30 yards ahead of them. The others only had Lucy's direction to guide them, for Aslan was not only invisible to them, but silent as well. His big cat-like paws made no noise on the grass. He led them right across the dancing trees. Whether they were still dancing, nobody knew, for Lucy had her eyes on the lion, and the rest had their eyes on Lucy. Near the edge of the gorge, cobbles and kettle drums, thought Trumpkin. I hope this madness isn't going to end in a mood-like climb and broken necks. For a long way, Aslan went along the top of the precipice. Then they came to a place where a little tree grew right on the edge. He turned and disappeared among them. Lucy held her breath, for it looked as if he had plunged over the cliff, but she was too busy keeping him in his sight to stop and think about this. She quickened her pace and was soon among the trees herself. Looking down, she could see a steep and narrow path going slantwise down into the gorge between the rocks, and Aslan descending it. He turned and looked at her with his happy eyes. Lucy clapped her hands and began to scramble down after him. From behind her, she heard the voices shouting, Hi, Lucy, look out, for goodness sake. You're right on the edge. Come back. And then a moment later, Edmund's voice saying, No, she's right. There is way down. Halfway down the path, Edmund caught up with her. Look, look. What's that shadow crawling down in front of us? It's his shadow, said Lucy. I do believe you're right, Ed. I can't think how I didn't see it before. But where is he? With his shadow, of course, said Lucy. Can't you see him? Well, I almost thought I did for a moment. It's such bad lighting. Oh, get on, King Edmund, came Trumpkin, his voice from behind him and above. And then far behind, staring nearly at the top, came Peter's voice. Oh, come on, Susan, give me your hand. Why, baby could get down here. And do stop fussing. In a few minutes, they were at the bottom, and the roaring water filled their ears, treading delicately like a cat. Aslan stepped from stone to stone across the stream. In the middle, he stopped, bent down, and raised his shaggy head, dripping from the water, and turned to face him again. This time Edmund saw him. Oh, Aslan, he cried, darting forward, but the lion whisked around and began padding up the slope at the far side of the rush. Peter, Peter, do you see? Cried Edmund. I saw something, but it's so tricky in the moonlight. On we go, though. 3 more cheers for Lucy. I don't feel half as tired now, either. Aslan, without hesitation, led them to their left, farther up the gorge. The whole journey was odd and dreamlike. The roaring stream, the wet gray grass, the glimmering cliffs which they were approaching, and always the gloriously silent pacing beast ahead. Everyone except Susan and the dwarf could see him now. Presently they came to another steep path up the faces of the farther precipices. These were far higher than the ones they had just descended, and the journey up them was long and tedious, zigzag. Fortunately, the moon shone right above the gorge, so neither side was in the shallow. Lucy was nearly all blown when the tail hind legs of Aslan disappeared over the top, but with one last effort she scrambled after him and came out rather shaky-legged and breathless on the hill they had been trying to reach ever since they had left Glasswater. The long, gentle slope, heather and white grass, and a few very big rocks shone white in the moonlight, stretched up to where it vanished in a glimmer of trees about a half-mile away. She knew it. It was the hill of the stone table. With a jingle of mail, the others climbed up behind her. Aslan glided on before them as they walked. "Lucy," said Susan in a very small voice. "Yes," said Lucy. "I see him now. I'm sorry." "That's all right, but I've been far worse than you know. I really believed it was him. Yesterday, when he warned us not to go down the fir wood. I really believed it was him tonight when he woke us up. I mean, deep down inside. Or I could have if I let myself. But I just wanted to get out of the woods, and I don't know. Whatever am I going to say to him?" "Perhaps you don't need to say much," suggested Lucy. Soon they reached the trees, and through them the children could see a great mound, Aslan's house, which had been raised over this stone table since their days. "Our side didn't keep a very good watch," muttered Trumpkin. "We ought to have been challenged before now." "Shh," said the other four, for Aslan stopped and turned and stood facing them, looking as majestic as they felt as anyone could who feels afraid, and as afraid as anyone who feels glad. The boys strode forward as Lucy made way for them. Susan and the dwarf shrank back. "Oh, Aslan," King Peter said, dropping one knee and raising the lion's heavy paw to his face. "I'm so glad and I'm so sorry. I've been leaving them wrong ever since we started, especially yesterday morning." "My dear son," said Aslan. And then he turned to and welcomed Edmund. "Well done," were his words. And then after an awful pause, but the deep voice says, "Susan." Susan made no answer, but the others thought she was crying. "You've listened to your fears, child. Come, let me breathe on you. Forget them. Are you brave again?" "A little, Aslan." "And now," said Aslan in a much louder voice with a hint of a roar in it, while his tail lashed, "and now where's this little dwarf, this famous swordsman and archer who doesn't believe in lions? Come here, son of earth, come here." The last word was no longer a hint of a roar, but was the real thing. "Wraiths and wreckage," gasped Trumpkin in the ghost voice. The children, who knew Aslan well enough to see that he liked the dwarf very much, were not disturbed, but it was quite another thing for Trumpkin, who had never seen a lion before, let alone this lion. He did the only sensible thing he could have done. That is, instead of bolting, he tottered toward Aslan. Aslan pounced. Have you ever seen a very young kitten being carried in the mother's cat's mouth? It was like that. The dwarf hunched up in a little miserable ball, hung from Aslan's mouth. The lion gave him one shake, and all of his armor rattled like a tinker pack. And then, hey, presto, the dwarf flew up in the air. He was not as safe as he had been, though he did not feel so. As he came down, the huge velvety paws caught him as gently as a mother's arms, and set him right way up, too, on the ground. "Son of earth, shall we be friends?" asked Aslan. "Yes," panted the dwarf, for it had not gotten its breath back yet. "Now, the moon is setting. Look behind you. The dawn is beginning. We have no time to lose. You three, you sons of Adam and sons of earth, hasten to the mound and deal with what you will find there." The dwarf was speechless. Neither of the boys dared ask Aslan if they would follow. All three drew their swords and saluted, and turned and jingled into the dusk. Lucy noticed that there was no sign of weariness in their faces. Both the High King and King Edmund looked more like men than boys. The girls watched them out of sight, standing close beside Aslan. The light was changing. Low down in the east, Aravar, the morning star of Narnia, gleamed like a little moon. Aslan, who seemed larger than before, lifted his head, shook his mane, and roared. The sound, the deep throbbing at first, came like an organ, beginning on a slow note, and rose and became louder and louder still, till the earth and air were shaking in it. It rose up to the hill and floated across all of Narnia, down into Miraz's camp. Men woke, stared palely at one another's faces, and grasped their weapons. Down below in the great river, now at its coldest hour, the heads and shoulders of nymphs and great weedy beard head of river god, whose rose from the water. Beyond it, in every field and wood, there lurted rabbits rose out of their holes, sleepy birds came out under their wings, owls hooted, vixens barked, hedgehogs grunted, and trees stirred. In small towns and villages, mothers pressed their babies close to their chests, staring with wild eyes. Dogs whimpered. Men leaped up, looking for light. Far away on the northern frontier, mountain giants peered in the dark gateway of their castles. What Lucy and Susan saw was a dark something coming from them in almost every direction across the hills. It looked at first as if it were a black mist creeping on the ground, and then like the stormy waves of Black Sea rising higher and higher as it came on, and then at last it was the woods on the move. All the trees of the world appeared to be rushing towards Aslan, but as they drew near, they looked less like trees, and the whole crowd, bowing and curtsying and waving long, thin arms to Aslan, were all around Lucy. She saw it was a crowd of human shapes. Pale birch girls were tossing their heads. Willow women pushed back their hair from their brooding faces to gaze on Aslan. Queenly beeches stood still and adored him. Shaggy oak men, lean and melancholy elms, shocked-headed hollies themselves, but their wives were all bright with berries, and happy Rowans all bowed and rose again, shouting, "Aslan, Aslan," their various husky or creaking or wave-like voices. The crowd that had danced around Aslan for it to become a dance once more grew so thick and rapid, Lucy was confused. She never was certain where other people came from or who this soon were capering about among the trees. One was youth, only dressed in fawn skin, with vine leaves wreathed in his curly hair. His face would have been almost too pretty for a boy's, yet it had not looked extremely wild. You felt, as Edmund said when he saw him a few days later, there was a chap who might do anything, absolutely anything. He seemed to have a great many names. Bromos, Berserius, and the Ram were three of them. There were a lot of girls with him, as wild as he. He was even unexpectedly someone on a donkey, and everyone was laughing and everyone was shouting out, "Eon, Eon, oi, oi, oi." "Is it a romp?" Aslan cried the youth. Apparently it was, but everyone seemed to have a different idea as to what they were playing. It may have been a tig, but Lucy never discovered who was it. It was rather like a blind man's buff, only everyone behaved as if they were blindfolded. It was not unlike the hunt of the slipper, but the slipper was never found. What made it more complicated was that the man on the donkey, who was old and enormously fat, began calling out at once, "Refreshments! Time for refreshments!" falling off his donkey and being bundled onto it again by the others, while the donkey was under the impression that the whole thing was a circus and tried a display of walking on its hind legs. All the time there were more and more vine leaves everywhere. Soon not only leaves but vines. They were climbing up everything. They were running up the legs of the tree people, circling around their necks. Lucy put her hands to push back her hair, and she found that she was pushing vine branches away. The donkey was a mass of them. His tail was completely entangled in something dark, nodding between his ears. Lucy looked again, and it was a bunch of grapes. After that, mostly grapes, overhead, underfoot, and all around. "Refreshments! Refreshments!" roared the old man. Everyone began eating. Whatever houses your people may have, you have never tasted such grapes. Really good grapes, firm and tight on the outside, but bursting into cool sweetness when you put them in your mouth, were one of the things the girls had never quite had enough of before. Here were more than anyone could possibly want, and no table manners at all. One saw sticky, stained fingers everywhere, and though their mouths were full, the laughter never ceased, nor the yodeling cries of "Eowyn, Eowyn, oi, oi, oi," till all of a sudden everyone felt at the same moment of the game, whatever it was, that the feast ought to be over, and everyone flopped down breathless on the ground and turned their faces to Aslan to hear what he would say. At that moment the sun was rising, and Lucy remembered something, whispered to Susan. "I say, Sue, I know who they are." "Who?" asked Susan. "The boy with the wild face is Bacchus, and the one on the old donkey is Selenius. Don't you remember long ago Mr. Thomas telling us about them?" "Why, of course, but I say, Lou." "What?" "I wouldn't have felt safe with Bacchus and all of his wild girls if we had not met them without Aslan." "I should think not," said Lucy. All right, and we will read more tomorrow.